Your disappearance would be the greatest gift to me, my daughter replied when I asked her what her wish was. My name is Margaret Ellison. My daughter once told me something that no mother should ever hear. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I remember the exact moment as if it were carved into my memory with a burning knife. It was a Sunday evening, the kind where the house felt quiet but expectant. My daughter Emily had come over with her little family for dinner. I had spent the entire day preparing her favorite roast chicken the way I used to make when she was a child. I thought the warmth of the meal might bring us closer again. Dinner was nearly over when I leaned across the table smiling and asked in the most innocent tone, "Emily, if you could have one wish right now, what would it be?" Her fork clinked against her plate. She looked at me, her expression flat, almost bored, and replied, "Your disappearance would be the greatest gift to me." The world seemed to tilt. At first, I thought I had misheard her. My smile froze, but her husband let out an awkward laugh, and my granddaughter's little eyes darted between us as if she had sensed the cruelty hidden in those words. Emily didn't take them back. She simply reached for her glass of wine, sipped, and looked away, as if what she said was a passing thought, something insignificant. But it wasn't insignificant to me. Those words were an earthquake shattering everything I had believed about my place in her life. I sat there, heart pounding, my hands trembling under the table. The meal I had cooked with so much care suddenly tasted like ash. My mind screamed at me to say something, to ask her why, but the weight of her coldness silenced me. I could only force a faint smile, pretending for the sake of the child sitting nearby. The rest of the evening blurred. Plates clattered, chairs scraped, voices hummed, but I felt distant, like I was watching it all from outside my own body. When Emily left that night, hugging her daughter tightly but barely brushing my arm with the coldest of touches, I stood in the doorway watching her walk away, a shadow of the girl I once cradled, kissed goodnight, and promised to protect forever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the dim light of my bedroom, hearing her words again and again. Your disappearance would be the greatest gift to me. It wasn't just a casual remark. It was venom carefully chosen. And what stung the most was the ease with which she said it, as if she had carried it inside for years, waiting for the right moment to release it. Memories flooded my mind, the nights I stayed up with her when she was sick, the sacrifices I made so she could attend the best schools, the countless times I put my own happiness on hold so she would never feel deprived. I thought motherhood was meant to be repaid with gratitude, or at least respect. But in that instant, I felt like every effort, every ounce of love had been thrown into a void. I rose from bed, pacing the quiet house. The ticking clock in the hallway sounded louder than ever. I glanced at the photographs hanging on the walls. Emily as a toddler with cake smeared on her cheeks. Emily holding her first trophy. Emily in her wedding dress. Each picture was supposed to be a memory of love, yet now, staring into her smiling face, all I saw was distance. I asked myself again and again, what did I do to deserve this? The next morning, I moved through the motions of life as if nothing had happened. At the grocery store, I smiled at the cashier, though my chest ached. At the library where I volunteered, I shelved books in silence, trying not to cry, as the children's section reminded me of the bedtime stories I used to read to her. But behind that mask of calm, I was unraveling. I replayed the dinner scene, constantly analyzing every detail, the tone of her voice, the absence of hesitation, the faint smirk at the corner of her lips. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was the truth. The cruelest part, no one else seemed to notice. Her husband hadn't defended me, hadn't even blinked beyond that nervous laugh. Her child was too young to understand. And so the weight of her words was mine alone to carry. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. But deep down, I feared the answer. What if she had always seen me as a burden? What if she had been waiting for years to finally voice what she truly felt? For days, I lived in that fear. I cooked meals but had no appetite. I answered phone calls but barely heard the conversations. I smiled at neighbors but felt hollow inside. My daughter's words became a poison that seeped into every corner of my life, and I realized something terrifying. I was starting to believe her. Maybe my disappearance really would be a gift. That thought crept in late at night, whispering to me in the quiet. It frightened me not because it was true, but because she had made me doubt myself, my worth, my very existence. But even in my lowest moment, a small voice inside me resisted. A mother doesn't just vanish. A mother fights even when her own child turns against her. And though Emily didn't know it yet, I was not ready to disappear. The silence after that dinner became louder than any words my daughter had spoken. Every corner of my house seemed to echo with the memory of her cruel wish. When I made coffee the next morning, I placed a second cup on the table out of habit, as if Emily might walk in like she used to on weekends when she was a teenager. But the chair across from me was empty, and the words she had spoken the night before still throbbed in my ears like a fresh wound. I carried that ache with me in the quiet moments, when folding laundry, when watering the plants, when straightening the photographs on the wall. Her words had burrowed inside me, making everything I touched feel tainted with rejection. I wasn't just a mother who had disappointed her child. I was a mother who had somehow become unwanted, erased before I was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Emily had spoken in a fit of frustration. Perhaps she hadn't meant it literally. But when I closed my eyes, I saw the deliberate way her lips had curved, the steadiness in her tone. It wasn't anger. It was conviction. That was what tore me apart. It wasn't a mistake. It was the truth she had been carrying. In the days that followed, I found myself drifting into old memories, as if I were searching for proof that I hadn't always been this unwanted presence in her life. I remembered the little girl who clung to my hand on the first day of school, who cried when I left her at kindergarten, who once whispered, "Don't ever leave me, Mommy." How could that same child grow into a woman who wished me gone? My chest tightened whenever I thought about it. I cooked dinner for myself and ended up pushing most of it aside. Nights stretched long with sleep slipping through my fingers no matter how many times I turned my pillow to the cool side. My body was present, but my mind was trapped, replaying that moment over and over. I avoided calling her. My pride wouldn't allow me to hear her voice again, not so soon. I knew if I spoke, I would hear the same coldness, and I wasn't sure my heart could survive it twice. So instead, I sat in my living room at dusk, staring out the window at the streetlights flickering on, and I wondered if other mothers felt this kind of invisible ache. I didn't tell anyone what she had said. To admit it out loud felt like admitting failure, like confessing that I had somehow ruined the one role that should have defined me, being a mother. People always say that motherhood is unconditional love, but what happens when the child withdraws their love in return? No one tells you how to survive that. The next Sunday at church, I looked around at the families sitting together. I watched a woman about my age smoothing her daughter's hair, another smiling as her son leaned against her shoulder. I smiled at them politely, but inside, I was breaking. Did they know how lucky they were? Did they realize that one cruel sentence could shatter decades of devotion? When the sermon ended, I lingered in my pew longer than usual. A few friends stopped to say hello, but I forced cheer into my responses, hiding the storm inside me. I didn't want them to see my pain. The humiliation of being unwanted by my own daughter was a secret I wasn't ready to share. But secrets have a way of weighing heavier than words. By the time I returned home, I felt drained, my body heavy, as if carrying her rejection had become a physical burden. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands pressed flat against the wood, and whispered to myself, "Why, Emily? Why would you say that?" Of course, no answer came. That evening, I tried to write in my old journal, something I hadn't done in years. My pen hovered over the page, trembling. I thought maybe if I wrote it out, I could make sense of it, but All I managed was a single sentence: "My daughter does not want me." I stared at the words until they blurred. That was the truth, raw and undeniable, and seeing it in ink made my stomach twist. I wanted to believe this was temporary, that perhaps time would soften her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that her words were not a sudden outburst. They were the culmination of years I had chosen not to see. The impatient sighs when I repeated myself. The way she rolled her eyes when I offered advice. The way her phone calls grew shorter, colder, almost obligatory. It wasn't one dinner that destroyed me. It was the realization that the dinner had only revealed what had already been there. For the first time in my life, I felt like an intruder in my own daughter's story. That night, I sat in the dark living room, the glow of the street lamp spilling across the rug. I thought of my late husband, of how he had always told me to be strong, to never let anyone, not even family, break me down. But it was easier said than done. Grief for him and grief for my daughter collided, leaving me hollow. I pressed my hands against my chest and felt the ache there, sharp and constant. I realized this wasn't just sadness. It was rejection, the kind that carves deep scars. But even through the ache, a spark of defiance began to stir. A voice whispered inside me, "You are still here. You still matter." I didn't yet know how to prove that voice right, but I knew I couldn't let Emily's words erase me. Not yet. It's strange how a single sentence can pull apart the threads of memory you once thought were whole. After Emily's wish, I began noticing things that had always been there, but that I had refused to see: fragments of rejection scattered across years. They weren't sudden blows. They were tiny cuts, each one ignored, until they finally bled into the wound her words had left behind. I thought back to birthdays. When she was younger, she used to make me handmade cards with shaky letters that read, "To the best mom in the world." But in recent years, birthdays passed with nothing more than a curt phone call or a rushed "Happy birthday, Mom, I'm busy right now." At the time, I told myself she was occupied with her own family, her own responsibilities. But now I wondered if it had been more than just distraction. Maybe it was disinterest. I remembered dinners too. There was one night a few months back when I tried to tell her a story about my neighbor's garden, something trivial but dear to me. She looked at me for a moment, then pulled out her phone mid-sentence and scrolled her eyes, never returning to mine. I had fallen silent, pretending it didn't hurt, but inside I felt like I had vanished before her eyes. Even her tone clipped impatient, as if every word I spoke was an interruption rather than a contribution, began to replay in my head. The sighs when I forgot a detail, the rolling of her eyes when I reminded her of a lesson I'd once taught. I used to laugh them off, convincing myself that all daughters grow weary of their mother's stories. But in truth, I had been ignoring the slow erosion of respect. One memory stood out with brutal clarity. It was last Christmas. I had spent weeks knitting a scarf for her, remembering how she loved blue when she was younger. I wrapped it carefully, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it beneath the tree. When she opened it, she forced a smile, said a faint thanks, and set it aside, reaching eagerly for a gift from her husband instead. She never wore the scarf. Later, I found it shoved in the back seat of her car, still in the box. I told myself it didn't matter. But now, remembering her wish, I realized it had mattered more than I allowed myself to admit. The signs had always been there, small, sharp, and accumulating. The impatience, the neglect, the dismissiveness. And I had chosen not to see, because seeing would mean acknowledging that my daughter had been slipping away from me long before her words cut so deep. I started replaying conversations in my head, listening not to what was said, but to what was absent. There was no warmth in her voice anymore, no eagerness to share her life with me. She told me facts, logistics, schedules, but never feelings. I was someone she updated, not someone she confided in. That realization hurt most of all. It made me wonder, had she been preparing me for this wish all along, conditioning me to fade into the background of her life? One afternoon, I found myself wandering into Emily's old room. It was a guest room now redecorated years ago, but a few traces of her childhood lingered in the closet. A stuffed bear missing an eye, a stack of old school papers, a crumpled drawing of the two of us holding hands. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the bear, and tears streamed down my face. How did we get from that little girl who once couldn't sleep without me beside her to the woman who wished me gone? The room smelled faintly of dust of things abandoned. That was what I felt like now, abandoned. It would have been easier if she had screamed at me, blamed me, given me something tangible to fight against. But her rejection wasn't loud. It was quiet, woven into the fabric of daily life, until it became undeniable. That night I tried to eat dinner, but every bite turned heavy in my mouth. I left the plate half full and sat by the window, staring out at the neighbors' children playing in their yard. Their laughter carried through the glass, sharp in contrast to the silence in my own house. And I thought to myself, they'll grow up too. Will they one day look at their mother the way Emily looks at me? The thought chilled me. My loneliness became heavier, pressing into my chest until I could barely breathe. I began to wonder if maybe Emily was right. Maybe my presence did nothing but weigh her down. Maybe the signs had been her way of telling me she needed freedom and I was too blind to see. But then another thought fought back, fragile but persistent. I gave her life. I gave her everything. Doesn't that count for something? The battle inside me raged between guilt that maybe I had failed and defiance that I deserved better than to be cast aside. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My face looked older, lines etched deeper by grief. But in my eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected, a flicker of anger. Not at myself, but at her. I realized then that this wasn't just about her cruelty. It was about my silence. For years, I had swallowed the small rejections, convincing myself they were harmless. But each one had carved away at me until nothing was left but an empty shell. And if I didn't confront this, if I didn't face the truth of what my daughter had become and what I had allowed, then her words would destroy me completely. So I whispered to my reflection, my voice trembling but determined. No more pretending. No more ignoring. I see it now. I didn't yet know what I would do or how I would survive this heartbreak, but I knew one thing with certainty: this story between me and Emily was far from over. The kitchen table used to be the heart of our home. When Emily was younger, she would chatter endlessly about her day, every friend, every crush, every dream, spilled out between bites of spaghetti or soup. I remember laughing so much during those meals that I sometimes forgot to eat. The table wasn't just wood and varnish. It was a stage for our lives where everything important was shared. But lately the table had turned cold. After her cruel wish, I couldn't help but notice the silence whenever we sat together. Meals no longer felt like gatherings. They felt like transactions. I would cook, place the plates, and she would eat without a word of thanks. Her husband scrolled through his phone between bites. My granddaughter, still too young to fully grasp tension, sometimes tried to fill the silence with babble, only to be shushed by her mother. It was as though my presence at the table was tolerated, not welcomed. I began to feel like an extra chair in the room, like a ghost who occupied space without meaning. Even when I tried to start conversations, commenting on the weather, asking about work, offering a story from my library shifts, Emily's eyes would glaze over, her answers clipped and short. Sometimes she didn't answer at all. One evening, I made lasagna, one of her childhood favorites. I thought maybe the familiar flavor might thaw the distance. I watched her carefully as she took her first bite. She chewed, slowly swallowed, and then reached for the salt shaker without looking up. She didn't even realize the dish had taken me 3 hours to prepare, kneading the dough myself just to make it perfect. Her silence stung more than any insult. I found myself staring at the food on my plate, unable to swallow. The clinking of utensils against porcelain sounded hollow, echoing the emptiness inside me. I remembered how years ago she would ask for seconds and laugh with her mouth full, her joy contagious. Now she barely looked at me. The kitchen, once warm with love, had become a stage for rejection. After dinner, I stood at the sink washing dishes while the others left the table. Through the doorway, I saw Emily leaning against the wall, scrolling her phone while her husband helped their daughter with shoes. Not once did she glance at me or offer to help. I was invisible, a servant in my own home. I pressed my wet hands against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. I wanted to scream, "Do you even see me anymore? Do you know how much I've given for you?" But the words stayed trapped in my throat. That night, I dreamed of the table from years ago, full of laughter and crumbs, her little hands reaching for mine. I woke with tears on my cheeks, realizing the table now held nothing but silence and memory. The following week, I tried something different. I thought maybe if I said nothing at all, she might notice the absence of my voice. During dinner, I sat quietly, chewing in silence, letting her conversations run without my interruptions. But she didn't notice. Or perhaps she did, and she preferred it that way. That realization cut deep. The empty table became a symbol for everything I had lost: the bond, the warmth, the sense that I mattered. It wasn't just about food. It was about being unseen in the very space where I once mattered most. I began to dread meals. Each one felt like a performance of indifference where I played the part of the unnecessary guest. My appetite dwindled, and even the smell of food turned heavy. Cooking once a joy became a duty performed out of habit. One night, after another dinner of silence, I stayed behind in the kitchen after they left. I sat alone at the table, my plate still half full, the air thick with what hadn't been said. I ran my hand across the surface of the wood, tracing the faint scratches left from years of use. I could almost hear echoes of laughter: Emily at age 10 spilling juice while telling a story about school. Emily at 16 rolling her eyes but smiling as she teased me about my cooking. Emily at 22 crying into her pasta after her first heartbreak, leaning into me as I comforted her. Now at 32, she barely looked at me. The ache in my chest grew sharper. I whispered into the empty kitchen, "When did you stop loving me?" My voice cracked the sound lost in the stillness, but even in the silence I knew the answer. It hadn't been sudden. It had been happening slowly, meal after meal, word after word left unsaid. The table hadn't emptied overnight. It had emptied drop by drop until one day there was nothing left but silence. I began skipping meals with them, making excuses. I claimed I wasn't hungry or that I had already eaten. Sometimes I sat in my room pretending to read while they dined in the kitchen without me. Part of me wanted them to notice my absence, to ask where I was. But they didn't. The table carried on without me as if I had never been there at all. And that was when the loneliness became unbearable. The table had once bound us together. Now it reminded me only of what I had lost. Still, even as I avoided the kitchen, I couldn't shake the memories. The sound of Emily's laughter as a child haunted me like a ghost, following me through every room. It was as if my house itself remembered the love she had forgotten. I realized then that the table was not empty because I had failed as a mother. It was empty because Emily had chosen to push me out of it. And the cruelest part, she seemed happier that way. It was around this time that I began noticing how much influence Emily's new circle had on her: her friends, her in-laws, the people she surrounded herself with since her marriage. It was subtle at first, but slowly it became clear they were feeding her disdain toward me, shaping her into someone I barely recognized. I met her mother-in-law Judith many times. She was the kind of woman who always spoke with a smile that never reached her eyes. At family gatherings, she would make small remarks, little digs coated in politeness. "Oh, Maggie, you still live alone? Must be so quiet," she once said, her tone dripping with condescension. Or, "Emily has really come into her own since marrying Michael. She doesn't need to lean on anyone now. Those words were sharp, and though they were meant to sound casual, I could feel the poison in them. Emily always laughed lightly, as if agreeing, and never defended me. I saw something in her eyes in those moments, a flicker of validation, as though she enjoyed watching me shrink under the weight of those remarks. Then there were her friends. Younger women, ambitious, polished, the kind who believed independence meant cutting ties with the past. At dinner once, one of them joked, "I told my mom if she ever tries to move in with me, I'll buy her a one-way ticket to Florida." They all laughed. I laughed too, though it felt like sandpaper in my throat. But Emily laughed hardest, her eyes darting toward me as if to say, "You hear that these weren't just jokes." They were seeds planted slowly in her heart, nurturing the belief that I was outdated, unnecessary, even a burden. I began to notice how Emily's tone shifted after spending time with them. Before, she would occasionally call me for advice about cooking, about raising her daughter, even about handling her marriage. But after weekends away with her friends or dinners with her in-laws, she came back sharper, colder. Suddenly, my advice became old-fashioned. My concerns became nagging. My presence became too much. One evening after she returned from a weekend trip, she came by my house. I had baked cookies for my granddaughter, hoping Emily would take some home. As she picked one up, she said casually, "Mom, you know you don't have to try so hard. I'm not a little girl anymore. You can't cling to me forever." Her words sliced through me. I hadn't been clinging, at least I didn't think so. I was only trying to show love in the only way I knew how. But to her, my gestures were burdens, not blessings. I wanted to ask her where she had learned to speak like that, but I already knew. Her husband didn't help either. Michael wasn't cruel, but he was indifferent. He never discouraged Emily's words, never tried to soften the blows. He seemed to believe that his wife's independence meant detaching from me completely. In his silence, he allowed the distance to grow. The worst was when Emily began comparing me to Judith. "Michael's mom never bothers him with little things," she once said, shaking her head at me. "She respects our space." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Judith, who constantly inserted herself, who dropped hints and judgments at every gathering respect. But to Emily, her mother-in-law was the standard, and I was the failure. Every comparison chipped away at me. I began second-guessing everything: my calls, my visits, even my words of affection. If I said too much, I was overbearing. If I said too little, I was cold. There was no middle ground where I was allowed to simply be her mother. I noticed, too, how she behaved differently when others were around. At a family party, when Judith was present, Emily kept her distance from me, speaking to me as if I were a stranger. But when it was just the two of us, rare as those moments were, she sometimes let her guard down, slipping into softer tones before catching herself. It was as if she was torn between the mother who raised her and the world that told her I was obsolete. But the more time passed, the more that world won. The breaking point came at a Sunday dinner. I had set the table, cooked a meal, and invited them over. Everything seemed calm at first until Judith, sipping wine, leaned toward Emily and said, "It's admirable that you still come here every week. Most women your age would have cut the cord already." The words hung in the air. I froze, my hands tightening around my fork. Emily laughed, a sharp, dismissive laugh, and replied, "Oh, believe me, sometimes I think about it." The table erupted with chuckles. I sat in silence, my face burning. Even Michael smiled faintly, though he quickly looked down at his plate. I wanted to disappear right then, not because I agreed with them, but because I couldn't bear being humiliated in my own home. My chest ached so fiercely that I thought I might cry in front of them all, but I held it in, forcing a smile that felt like it would crack my face. After they left that night, I sat alone at the empty table, staring at the candle that had burned down to nothing. My house smelled of food no one appreciated. My hands ached from hours of labor that went unnoticed, and my heart felt like it had been trampled under the weight of their laughter. It was clear now Emily didn't just grow distant on her own. She had helped people who whispered in her ear, teaching her to see me not as a mother, but as a burden. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something terrifying. Maybe Emily didn't just wish me gone because of her own feelings. Maybe she believed it was what the world expected of her. But whether it was her voice or theirs, the result was the same. I was being erased. I had told myself countless times to stay quiet, to endure the silence, the cold remarks, the comparisons, because maybe if I waited long enough, Emily would soften. But silence has a way of turning into surrender, and I realized I had been surrendering for too long. The weight of her words, the laughter at my expense, the indifference they pressed on my chest until I couldn't breathe anymore. One evening, I decided I could not endure it any longer. It was after another dinner at my house. I had made soup light and fragrant, something I thought would be easy for everyone to enjoy. But the same routine unfolded. She ate quickly, barely speaking, her husband scrolling his phone, their child restless. When the plates were cleared, I stood at the sink washing dishes while Emily scrolled through her phone at the table. The silence grew unbearable. My hands trembled in the soapy water. I turned, my voice breaking, and said softly, "Emily, did you really mean what you said that night? That my disappearance would be a gift?" The words filled the room like a stone dropping into a still pond. Her head lifted, her eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought she might dismiss it, laugh it off, claim it was a misunderstanding. But she didn't. She put her phone down and looked straight at me. "Yes, I meant it," she said flatly. "Mom, you don't understand. You smother me. You're always there, always trying to be part of everything. I need space. I need a life that isn't tied to you." I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. My heart pounded, each beat louder than the last. "Smother you," I whispered. "Emily, all I've ever done is try to be there for you. That's what mothers do." She let out a sharp laugh, bitter and humorless. "Maybe once, but not anymore. You can't let go. You cook meals no one asks for. You show up when you're not needed. You act like I can't make decisions without you. It's exhausting." Her words sliced into me deeper than the first wound. This wasn't just rejection. This was a deliberate tearing down of everything I thought I had done right. "I only wanted to help," I said weakly, my voice trembling. "That's just it," she snapped. "I don't need your help. I don't need you hovering. Honestly, sometimes I think things would be easier if you weren't here at all." My breath caught. It was the same sentiment, only sharper, now stripped of any pretense. Her husband shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. He didn't defend me, didn't stop her. He just looked at the floor as though my pain was something inconvenient. I felt myself swaying as if the ground beneath me had cracked. I gripped the counter tighter, steadying myself, but the tears were already burning my eyes. "How can you say that to me?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I gave you everything. I raised you, sacrificed for you, loved you more than my own life. How can you look me in the eye and tell me I'm a burden?" For the first time, she looked uneasy. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes shifting away. But then she squared her shoulders and said, "Because it's the truth. You just don't want to hear it." Silence swallowed the room. I stared at her, at the daughter I once held in my arms, the daughter I once believed would always need me. Now she sat across the table like a stranger, her eyes cold, her words brutal. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand she remember every moment I had been there for her. But my voice failed me. Instead, I felt the tears finally spill over, rolling down my cheeks. I hated myself for crying in front of her, for showing her how deeply she had cut me. Emily sighed as if my pain were an inconvenience. "Mom, don't make this dramatic. I'm just being honest." Honest. That word echoed like a curse. If this was honesty, then it was the kind that destroyed. Her daughter came into the room, then tugging at Emily's sleeve, asking for attention. Emily turned to her child with a smile, the kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I stood frozen, watching her transform into a loving mother in the same breath that she tore me apart. And in that moment, I realized something chilling: she had love in her heart. She simply chose not to give it to me anymore. I excused myself, quietly retreating to my bedroom under the guise of needing rest. Once the door closed, I collapsed against it, my body shaking with sobs I had held back for too long. The sound of laughter from the living room seeped through the walls, a cruel reminder that life went on for them, untouched by my heartbreak. Lying in bed later, I replayed her words in my head. Easier if you weren't here at all. They were the kind of words you couldn't forget no matter how much you wanted to. That night, something broke inside me. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. I realized Emily didn't just see me as unnecessary, she saw me as an obstacle. And obstacles aren't loved. Obstacles are removed. The ache in my chest was unbearable, but beneath it something else stirred. A quiet, simmering anger. For years I had swallowed my pain, convinced myself it was just my imagination, excused her coldness as stress. But now I had heard the truth, raw and unfiltered. I couldn't pretend anymore. After that night, something inside me gave way. It was as if the confrontation had stripped away the last thread I had been clinging to, leaving me bare and exposed. Her words echoed in my head at every hour of the day. It would be easier if you weren't here at all. I moved through my routines like a shadow. I made coffee but never drank it. I cooked small meals and let them go cold on the counter. I sat by the window with a book open on my lap, but my eyes never moved across the page. Every thought came back to her rejection, looping endlessly until it drowned out everything else. For the first time in my life, I began to question not just my role as a mother, but my right to exist at all. Was I truly smothering her? Was I nothing but an obstacle? I had sacrificed so much: my career, my happiness, my health, all for her. But perhaps I thought love given in the wrong way becomes poison. Perhaps I had poisoned her life with my presence. The isolation grew heavier each day. I stopped calling friends from church. I avoided neighbors. When I walked into town for groceries, I kept my eyes down, afraid someone might ask how I was. What would I say? That my daughter wished me gone? That the person I loved most in the world had declared my existence a burden? There were no words for that kind of shame. Nights became the worst. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I remembered when Emily was small, how she would crawl into bed with me after nightmares, her little body warm against mine, whispering, "Don't leave me, Mommy." The memory felt like a cruel trick now, as if the universe were mocking me with what once was. One night I got up and stood in front of the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked like a stranger. Her face was tired, her eyes dull, her shoulders slumped under invisible burdens. I raised my hand, touched the glass, and whispered, "Maybe she's right. Maybe I am nothing but a weight she wants to drop." The thought terrified me, but it lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. I stopped inviting Emily over for dinner. I stopped sending her little messages. I thought maybe if I stepped back, gave her the distance she claimed to need, she might come searching for me. But she didn't. Days turned into weeks, and the phone never rang. My doorbell never chimed. Her absence confirmed the truth: she was happier without me. I started closing off parts of the house. I stopped going into the kitchen where the silence at the table haunted me. I avoided the living room where her laughter once filled the air. I stayed mostly in my bedroom, where the world felt smaller, easier to endure. The house that had once been alive with family became a tomb, and I was its only occupant. The loneliness was suffocating. Sometimes I thought I could hear the house itself grieving with me, the creak of the floorboards, the groan of the pipes, the echo of footsteps that no longer belonged to anyone but me. It was in that silence that my mind began to turn cruel. I started imagining what life would be like if I simply disappeared. Would Emily feel relief as she said? Would she breathe easier, finally free of the weight of me? Would she even notice at all? I hated myself for those thoughts. But they came anyway, creeping into my heart like shadows. One Sunday, I stayed home from church too ashamed to face anyone. I sat by the window watching the street outside. Families walked together, children tugging at their mothers' hands, laughter floating in the air. I pressed my forehead against the glass and felt tears slip down my cheeks. I wasn't part of that world anymore. The next day, I found myself sorting through old boxes searching for something to anchor me. Photographs, letters, small keepsakes. But instead of comfort, they brought more pain. Every picture of Emily smiling with me felt like a lie. Every birthday card she once gave me felt like it belonged to someone else's child. The rejection hollowed me out. I felt like an abandoned shell, walking and breathing but empty inside. And yet, even in that darkness, there was a spark, faint, but there. A whisper inside me that said, "No, you are more than what she says. You are more than the pain she inflicts." But the whisper was drowned out by the louder voice of doubt. One night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, the same table that had once been the heart of my home. I stared at the empty chair across from me, imagining her sitting there looking at me the way she used to. I whispered, "Emily, what did I do so wrong? Tell me how I lost you." Of course, no answer came. Only silence. It was then I realized I was at my breaking point. Something had to change. I couldn't keep dissolving into this shadow of myself, waiting for her to love me again. I either had to accept the truth of her rejection or find a way to fight against it. But at that moment, I didn't know how to do either. So I sat there broken and small, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the sound of my own heart aching in the quiet. It was on one of those gray afternoons, the kind where the sky presses low and the light seeps weakly through the windows, that I decided to go into the attic. I hadn't opened my late husband Thomas's boxes in years, not since the funeral. They sat stacked in corners, gathering dust, holding pieces of a life I had been too afraid to touch. But something inside me pushed me upward that day, as though answers I had long avoided were waiting for me there. The attic smelled of cedar and old paper. I pulled open one box after another, his sweaters still faintly scented with the cologne he always wore, photo albums, his teaching notes from the years before his illness. Each item tugged at memories I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face. Then, at the bottom of one trunk, I found a bundle of letters tied with twine. My hands trembled as I picked them up. The envelopes were yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Thomas's firm, deliberate script. On the top envelope were the words, "For Margaret, if you ever need to understand." A chill went through me. I carried the bundle downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and untied the twine. The first letter was dated nearly 20 years ago, when Emily was still in high school. I unfolded it carefully and began to read. "Me, I know you always try to hold the family together, but I worry about Emily. She feels overshadowed by Caleb. She doesn't say it directly, but I can see it in her eyes. Every time he succeeds, she shrinks a little more. Every time you praise him, she believes you've forgotten her." I stopped, my breath catching. Caleb, my son, her younger brother. I hadn't thought of it that way before. Caleb had always been bright, ambitious, the kind of boy who chased recognition and often received it. Emily was quieter, more hesitant, and perhaps I had overlooked how deep her silence went. I turned to the next letter. "Emily doesn't talk to me the way she used to. She's angry, though she won't admit it. She thinks you protect Caleb more than her. When he was caught shoplifting, you defended him, saying he was just lost, while Emily remembers every scolding you gave her for smaller mistakes. I fear she's storing this resentment, and I don't know how to reach her." The words burned my eyes. The shoplifting incident, I remembered it vividly. Caleb had been caught stealing headphones from a store. I had marched down there, my heart breaking, but I begged the manager not to press charges, promising Caleb would change. I grounded him for weeks, but I also comforted him, afraid he would drift too far. Had Emily seen that as favoritism? I had thought she understood I was trying to protect the family's name to save her brother from a record that could ruin him. But perhaps all she saw was a mother who defended him while being harsher with her. Letter after letter, Thomas's voice spoke from the past, weaving together a picture of my daughter I had refused to see. She believes you never listen. She tells me you love her, but you don't see her. She thinks every decision you make still tries to control her life. She told me once that she envies the freedom Caleb has, that you let him stumble and forgive him, but you never give her the same grace. I covered my mouth with my hand, the tears streaming now. My body shook as though each word was a blade turning in my chest. There was one final letter, undated perhaps, written not long before Thomas passed. If you are reading this, Margaret, it means I'm no longer here. And if Emily has turned away from you, please remember it is not only your fault. She carries jealousy and bitterness that I could never take from her. But don't let her darkness convince you that you are unworthy of love. You gave everything, perhaps too much, and she may never forgive you for being human. Still, you must forgive yourself. The paper slipped from my fingers. I sat at the table, my hands shaking, the letters spread before me like fragments of a truth I had never wanted to face. So it wasn't just about now. It wasn't only her friends or her in-laws poisoning her against me. The resentment had been growing for years quietly like roots under soil. And I, blind with hope, had walked over that ground, never realizing the cracks beneath my feet. I felt guilt gnawing at me. Had I truly favored Caleb? Had I been harsher with Emily without realizing it? The memories blurred together, moments of discipline, words spoken in frustration, times when I told her to be stronger, better, more careful. Maybe she had stored every one of those moments as proof that I loved her less. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. The house around me seemed to hold its breath. For years I had believed Emily's coldness was sudden, something that changed after her marriage. But now I saw it differently. The marriage, the friends, the in-laws, they hadn't planted the seed. They had only watered it. The seed had been there all along. I gathered the letters back into the bundle and pressed them to my chest. For a moment, I could almost feel Thomas's hand on my shoulder, steady and warm, as if he were telling me once more not to let this destroy me. But the truth was unbearable. I whispered into the empty room, "Emily, did you ever love me? Or was it always this way?" The silence gave me no answer. I placed the letters in a drawer beside my bed that night, unable to throw them away, but too pained to keep them near. They were a mirror of everything I had lost and everything I had failed to see. And as I lay down staring at the ceiling, one thought haunted me above all. Her rejection wasn't born that night at the dinner table. It had been building silently for years, and I had been too blind, too hopeful to notice. The bundle of letters didn't just open old wounds, it explained them. For days afterward, I kept returning to Thomas's words, reading them again and again, until they felt etched into my skin. Each sentence peeled back layers of history I had wrapped in denial. My daughter's cruelty had not been sudden. It had been cultivated year after year, watered by jealousy, hardened by misunderstanding. I began to trace the timeline in my head, linking the past to the present. Caleb. Always Caleb. From the beginning, there had been a divide I hadn't seen clearly enough. Emily was my firstborn, careful, studious, obedient. She did what I asked, rarely caused trouble. I held her to higher standards, expecting her to be the responsible one. When Caleb came along, I was older, tired, perhaps softer. He was reckless but charming, and I forgave him things I would never have forgiven her. I thought I was balancing them. I thought she understood. But now, reading Thomas's words, I realized Emily had been quietly keeping score all along. Every time I praised Caleb for a success, she saw it as me ignoring her. Every time I forgave his mistakes, she saw it as me condemning her. and the resentment built until it became part of her like a shadow she carried. I remembered a moment when she was 15. She had studied hard for an exam, scored well, but I was so preoccupied with Caleb's suspension from school that I barely acknowledged her accomplishment. She stood in the kitchen doorway, her test paper in hand, waiting for me to notice. I gave her a quick smile, told her good job, then rushed back to deal with her brother's mess. I hadn't realized at the time how much that might have hurt her. Or the time she came home from a breakup, her eyes red and swollen. I tried to comfort her, but Caleb stumbled in drunk that same night, and my attention shifted to cleaning him up, shielding him from consequences. She watched me fuss over him while she sat alone on the couch, her heartbreak unnoticed. I thought she was strong enough to handle it. But maybe what she saw was proof that I always chose him over her. The letters gave shape to a truth I had ignored. Emily's bitterness wasn't just cruelty, it was betrayal she had been carrying in her own heart, a betrayal she believed I committed against her. And now, years later, that bitterness had grown into hatred. I sat in my bedroom holding one of the letters, whispering, "Why didn't you tell me, Emily? Why didn't you say how much it hurt?" But deep down I knew. She had been saying it all along, in her silences, in her clipped tones, in the cold way she dismissed me. I had just chosen not to hear. Her cruel words at the dinner table weren't born in that moment. They were the culmination of years of feeling unseen. But still a question gnawed at me. Did that justify her wish for my disappearance? Did my mistakes as a mother warrant such cruelty? I couldn't answer it. One evening, I found myself standing in Emily's old room again, clutching the stuffed bear I had unearthed before. I whispered into the quiet, "I tried, Emily. I did the best I could. Why isn't that enough?" Tears slid down my face, but this time they weren't just grief. They were anger too. Because even if I had failed her in moments, I had given her everything. I had sacrificed sleep, money, dreams, years of my life. I had endured loneliness after Thomas's death just so she would never feel abandoned. And yet all of it had been erased by her resentment. That was betrayal. Not just hers, but mine too, a betrayal of myself for believing my love was enough to heal what I hadn't seen. In the following days, I began noticing other patterns. The way Emily rarely mentioned her childhood, unless it was to highlight something she felt I had done wrong. The way she bristled when I spoke fondly of Caleb, even casually. The way she dismissed every gesture of love from me as though it were a burden she had to tolerate. It wasn't just rejection anymore. It was punishment. She wanted me to pay for the wounds she believed I inflicted. The realization hollowed me. For years I had clung to the idea that my daughter's love was still there, buried under stress or bad influences. But now I saw it differently. Her love had been replaced with something else, a ledger of wrongs, a list of failures she replayed in her mind. And in her eyes, my disappearance wasn't just a wish, it was justice. One night, unable to sleep, I took the letters out again and spread them across my bed. Thomas's words blurred through my tears, but one line from the last letter stood out. "Don't let her darkness convince you that you are unworthy of love." I clutched the paper, whispering, "Thomas, how do I do that? How do I fight when the person I love most has turned me into her enemy?" The silence gave me no answer, but as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I felt something shift. A spark, faint, but growing. Maybe Emily thought she had all the power now, but she didn't know about these letters. She didn't know that I understood the roots of her bitterness. She didn't know that I had proof that her hatred wasn't the whole story, that it came from places of jealousy, misunderstanding, and unspoken wounds. For the first time, I thought about what it would mean to reveal this truth, not just to her, but to everyone who had judged me, dismissed me, laughed at me. The thought was terrifying, but it was also liberating, because if she saw me as a villain, maybe it was time the world knew the whole story. I whispered into the darkness, my voice steady for the first time in months. How do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone? The thought lingered in my mind long after I whispered it into the night. What will they do when I reveal everything? For weeks, I had lived with the crushing weight of Emily's rejection suffocating beneath her words. But the letters had changed something in me. They gave me clarity, even power. Silence, I realized, was no longer protection, it was surrender. And I had surrendered for far too long. For years, I had allowed her bitterness to dictate the story of who I was. To her friends, to her in-laws, to her husband, I was the overbearing mother, the clingy widow, the woman who couldn't let go. And because I never spoke up, that became the only story anyone heard. But now I knew the truth. Her cruelty was not born of my weakness, but of her own jealousy, her own wounds that she refused to heal. I sat at the kitchen table one morning with the letters spread before me, my coffee growing cold. My hands shook as I picked up the last one again. Thomas's plea to me, "Don't let her darkness convince you that you are unworthy of love." I realized it was more than a comfort. It was a call to action. I couldn't change Emily's heart, but I could reclaim my dignity. The decision didn't come all at once. It built slowly like a tide rising higher with each wave. The more I replayed her words, "It would be easier if you weren't here at all," the more I knew I couldn't let them define me. If I remained silent, if I allowed her to erase me, then she would succeed. She would get her wish not through my disappearance, but through my surrender. And I refused to disappear. The first step was small. I began writing. I pulled out my old leather-bound journal and started recording everything, not just her cruel words, but the years of little slights, the moments of neglect, the dismissive laughs. I wrote about Christmas mornings when she looked past my gifts, about dinners, when she ignored me, about the sting of her comparisons to her mother-in-law. It was painful, but also cathartic. For the first time, the story was mine. Not hers, not theirs. Mine. Then I added the letters. I transcribed Thomas's words into the journal, weaving them into my own. His voice gave weight to my truth, evidence that what I felt wasn't just my imagination. Every night I wrote until my hand cramped, pouring out years of hurt onto the pages. When I closed the journal, I felt lighter, as though the weight was finally shifting off my shoulders. But writing wasn't enough. I began to think about speaking. Not just to Emily, she had already made her stance clear, but to others. To her husband, who had watched me shrink in silence. To Judith, her smug mother-in-law, who looked down on me with disdain. To the friends who laughed at cruel jokes about mothers being burdens. To anyone who believed Emily's version of me. For so long I had been painted as the villain. Perhaps it was time they saw the truth. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. I had always been quiet, the kind of woman who endured rather than fought. But endurance had cost me everything. Maybe fighting was the only way left to reclaim myself. I started with small acts of defiance. When Emily visited, I no longer rushed to cook elaborate meals. I placed simple dishes on the table, enough to eat, but nothing more. If she noticed, she said nothing, but I felt a flicker of satisfaction. For once, I wasn't bending myself to her expectations. I also stopped chasing her attention. When she ignored me during conversations, I stopped filling the silence. Instead, I let the quiet stretch until she grew uncomfortable. When she rolled her eyes, I met her gaze firmly instead of looking away. These were tiny rebellions, but they reminded me I still had a voice. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The true decision came one evening when I was sitting by the window watching the streetlights flicker on. I imagined what would happen if I gathered them all: Emily, her husband Judith, her friends, and laid everything bare. The truth of her jealousy, the evidence of Thomas's letters, the sacrifices I had made, the reality of who I was, not the distorted shadow she painted me to be. The image filled me with both dread and determination. I realized then that my silence had been protecting not me, but her. By keeping the truth hidden, I allowed her to continue her narrative unchallenged, and in doing so, I erased myself. No more. That night, I placed the letters and my journal into a box. I held it tightly, whispering to myself, "This is my story, and I will tell it." I didn't know exactly when or how I would reveal it, but the decision was made. The fear that had kept me trapped began to loosen its grip, replaced by something fiercer resolve. For the first time in months, I slept without tears. In the days that followed, I began preparing quietly. I organized photographs, letters, old mementos, not out of nostalgia, but as evidence. Proof of the love I had given, proof of the sacrifices I had made, proof that I was not the monster Emily painted me to be. Every detail became part of my case, not against her, but for myself. I no longer felt like a ghost in my own home. I moved with purpose, each step guided by the thought, "She will not erase me, not anymore." It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about reclaiming the dignity she had tried to strip from me. And though I trembled at the thought of what was to come, I knew one thing with certainty: silence was over. The time for truth was near. Once I made the decision to break my silence, I felt both liberated and burdened. Liberated because I finally had direction. I would no longer sit quietly and allow myself to be erased. But burdened because the truth was heavy, and I knew revealing it would not come without consequences. I began preparing as though I were assembling a case in a courtroom, only the trial would be held in the very space where my dignity had been torn apart. I started with the photographs. I pulled albums from the shelves and spread them across the dining room table. There was Emily as a newborn, swaddled in my arms, her tiny hand gripping my finger. Emily at 7, grinning wide with missing teeth, holding up a cake I had baked. Emily at 16, standing nervously in her prom dress while I adjusted the hem. Each image told a story she now refused to see, a story of love, care, sacrifice. Then there were the letters. Not just Thomas's bundle, but old cards Emily herself had written. "Best mom ever," one said in a child's scrawl. Another from middle school read, "Thank you for helping me with my project. I couldn't have done it without you." I held these letters and thought, at some point she knew my worth. At some point she loved me. These pieces of paper were my witnesses, proof that I had not imagined the bond between us. I added my journal to the pile, pages now filled with years of hurt and the clarity of Thomas's words. Writing it had been a release, but now it became part of my evidence. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed courage. And so each day I rehearsed in my mind what I might say when the time came. I imagined standing before Emily, before her husband, before Judith, before anyone who had judged me, and speaking with the strength I had buried for so long. At first, my rehearsals were timid whispers muttered into the stillness of my room. "I was never the burden you painted me to be. I gave you everything, even when it cost me myself." The words trembled, uncertain, but each time I repeated them, they grew stronger, steadier, until my voice no longer cracked. Still, the weight pressed heavily on me. Nights became sleepless again, not with despair this time, but with anticipation. The storm was gathering, and I was its center. One evening, Emily called unexpectedly. Her voice was casual, detached, as though our confrontation weeks earlier had never happened. "Mom, we'll be over Sunday. Michael wants to bring his parents too." My stomach tightened, but I forced my tone to remain even. "Of course. I'll prepare dinner." When I hung up, I stared at the phone in my hand, heart pounding. This was it. The moment I had been preparing for. They would all be here around my table, and I would no longer be silent. The days leading up to Sunday were filled with both fear and resolve. I moved through the house, gathering everything I had prepared: the letters, the photos, the journal, placing them neatly into a box on the sideboard. Every time I passed it, I felt its weight like a promise. but fear whispered constantly. What if they laugh? What if they dismiss you again? What if Emily grows colder, crueler than before? I silenced that voice with Thomas's words. Don't let her darkness convince you that you are unworthy of love. Saturday night, I barely slept. I lay awake imagining every possible outcome. Would Emily storm out? Would her friends mock me? Would Judith roll her eyes and declare me dramatic? But no matter the scenario, one truth remained. At least they would hear me. At least my silence would end. Sunday arrived with a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick and still. I set the table carefully, not with the elaborate meals I used to make, but with simple dishes: roasted chicken, vegetables, bread. I didn't want the food to be the focus. The truth was, the meal I would serve. When the doorbell rang, my heart hammered. Emily walked in with her husband, their daughter skipping beside them. Judith followed, her perfume filling the room. Their chatter was casual, but I could hear the undercurrent of dismissal in every word. We sat down, plates clinked, conversation meandered. I watched Emily laugh with Judith, watched Michael nod along, watched my granddaughter giggle, and I thought, how many times have I sat at this table invisible, silenced by their indifference? Not today. Halfway through the meal I stood. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled. Before dessert, I said, I have something I need to share. The table grew quiet. Forks paused midair. Emily's eyes narrowed. Mom, what is this about? I walked to the sideboard, lifted the box, and placed it in the center of the table. This is my story, I said. And today, you will listen. Emily scoffed, shaking her head. Mom, not now. Yes. I cut in sharper than I had ever spoken to her. Now. I opened the box and pulled out the first photograph, Emily as a little girl beaming in my arms. I laid it on the table. Do you remember this, Emily? You once called me your best friend. Her cheeks flushed. She glanced at Michael, at Judith, then back at me. That was a long time ago. I placed another photograph, another letter, another card. With each one, my voice grew stronger. You say I was a burden. You say my disappearance would be a gift. But these, I pointed to the items, prove I was more than that. I was your mother. I gave you everything. And I will not let you erase that. Judith shifted uncomfortably. Michael cleared his throat but said nothing. Emily's face hardened, but I pressed on. Finally, I placed Thomas's letters on the table. My hands shook, but my voice did not. Your father saw the bitterness in you long before I did. He warned me. He knew you carried jealousy, resentment, and he asked me not to let it destroy me. I didn't listen then, but I will now. The silence was deafening. Emily's eyes widened, then narrowed again, her lips parting as though to argue, but no words came. I stood taller than I had in years, my voice steady, my chest rising with long suppressed strength. You may see me as a burden, but I refuse to disappear. Not for you. Not for anyone. The room had gone still after I laid down Thomas's letters. For a long moment no one moved. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock, each second dragging heavy between us. Emily's eyes darted over the letters, then to me, her expression a mixture of shock and anger. She pushed her chair back slightly as though to distance herself from what lay on the table. This is ridiculous, she muttered. Is it? I asked quietly, my voice steady, though my hands trembled at my sides. Read them, Emily. Read your father's words. He saw what you carried inside you long before you ever said it aloud. He knew the resentment, the jealousy. He warned me. But I kept believing love would be enough. Her husband leaned forward, glancing at the letters but not touching them. His face was uneasy, caught between disbelief and recognition. Judith, however, crossed her arms, her lips curling in disdain. Margaret, she said smoothly, this is highly inappropriate. Airing your dirty laundry like this in front of family. Family, I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. Family doesn't tell you that your disappearance would be a gift. Family doesn't sit at your table week after week and treat you like a shadow. If we are to speak of family, then let's speak of truth. Judith faltered, her mouth snapping shut. I turned back to Emily. My heart was pounding, but the words flowed now, years of silence breaking open like a flood. You think I smothered you? You think I held too tightly? But what you never saw is how many nights I stayed awake wondering if I was enough. How many sacrifices I made, jobs I turned down, dreams I buried, all so you and your brother could have more than I ever did. And for what, to be told I should vanish? Emily's cheeks flushed crimson. You don't understand, Mom? No, I said firmly, cutting across her. It's you who doesn't understand. You carry bitterness like armor, blaming me for every wound you've ever felt. Yes, I was stricter with you. Yes, I defended Caleb when he stumbled, but I also believed in your strength. I thought you were the one who didn't need saving. And instead of seeing my faith in you, you twisted it into neglect. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. I reached into the box and pulled out one of her childhood cards, holding it up. Do you remember writing this, best mom ever? Those were your words. You once knew my love. You once felt it. But somewhere along the way you decided it wasn't enough. And you let jealousy turn it sour. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the card. I caught the flicker of guilt in his eyes, maybe because he had allowed Emily's bitterness to fester unchecked, maybe because he had stood by in silence while she tore me down. Emily finally spoke, her voice shaking. You don't know what it was like, Mom. Growing up, it was always Caleb this, Caleb that. Every time I made a mistake, you reminded me to be better. Every time he failed, you covered for him. Do you know what that feels like? To never be enough, no matter what I did. Her words struck me hard, not because they were cruel, but because they were true, at least from her perspective. I swallowed, forcing the lump from my throat. Yes, Emily. Maybe I failed you in ways I didn't realize. Maybe I thought I was teaching you strength, when all I was doing was making you feel unseen. But hear me now. My failures as a mother do not erase my love, and they do not give you the right to erase me. The room was heavy with silence. Judith shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable, but for once, she held her tongue. Michael looked down at his hands. My granddaughter, too young to fully understand, sat wide-eyed, sensing the tension, but not its weight. Emily pressed her palms flat on the table, her voice rising. You think this makes you the victim? You think a few old letters and pictures erase the years I felt invisible? No, I said softly. Nothing erases the past. Not my mistakes. Not your resentment. But the difference between us is this. I never wished you gone. Not once. Even in my worst pain, even when your words cut me to the bone, I never wanted a life without you. And that is the truth you cannot rewrite. Tears stung my eyes, but I held her gaze. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. Emily's face wavered, her anger flickering into something else. Guilt, grief, maybe even recognition. But just as quickly she masked it, shaking her head. This changes nothing. Maybe not for you, I said, my voice steady. But it changes everything for me. I have carried the weight of your rejection in silence, believing I was worthless. No more. If you cannot love me, if you cannot forgive me, then that is your choice. But I will not disappear for you. I will not vanish quietly to make your life easier. The words hung in the air, final and unshakable. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Michael reached across the table, placing his hand over the letters. He didn't say much, only Emily. Maybe you should read them. Judith frowned, but the command in his tone silenced her. Emily's hands trembled as she pulled one of the letters toward her. Her eyes skimmed the lines, her lips tightening. I watched her shoulders stiffen, then sag, as though the words pressed a weight onto her she could no longer deny. She didn't look at me, not yet. But I saw the crack in her armor. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but lighter than I had felt in years. I had spoken the truth. I had laid everything bare. And even if she never forgave me, even if she never softened, I knew this: I had reclaimed my dignity. The storm had broken, and I was still standing. After that night, the house fell into a strange, weighted silence. They had left in haste, Emily clutching the letters as though they burned her fingers, Michael quiet in his own conflicted way, Judith pursing her lips but unable to disguise the unease in her eyes. My granddaughter had only waved goodbye with her small hand confused, but smiling as though nothing monumental had just cracked the foundation of her family. When the door shut behind them, I sank into my chair, my body trembling, every ounce of energy drained from me. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was mine. I sat there for a long time, staring at the table littered with photographs, letters, cards, fragments of a life I had spent trying to prove pieces of a love that could no longer be denied. The storm had passed, but the echoes of it lingered in my chest. For days afterward, Emily didn't call. Neither did Michael. Judith's sharp voice was absent, and the air around me grew calm. At first, I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had broken the last fragile thread connecting us. But each time the doubt tried to creep in, I reminded myself, silence is not surrender. I told the truth. I chose myself. It was not easy. I would walk past the phone and feel the ache in my chest, longing for it to ring. I still dreamed of her as a child, running toward me with open arms. But when I woke, I no longer let the dream turn into shame. Instead, I told myself I did what I could. I loved as best I knew how. And that is enough. The weight on my shoulders lifted slowly like a fog clearing after years of darkness. One morning, as I watered the plants by the window, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass. My face was older, yes, but my eyes were different now, steadier, brighter. There was a spark I hadn't seen in years. I touched the glass lightly, whispering, "You're still here. You still matter." In that moment, I realized something profound: my worth had never been tied to Emily's acceptance. I had spent so many years believing her love defined me, that without it I was nothing. But I was wrong. I was more than her rejection, more than her bitterness. I was a woman who had lived, sacrificed, endured, and survived. And though Emily might never admit it, though she might never say the words I longed to hear, I knew deep down she could not erase me. A week later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Emily stood there, pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She didn't step inside. She didn't smile. She only held out the bundle of letters, her hands shaking. "I've been reading them," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word. I waited, my heart pounding, but I didn't rush to fill the silence. Finally, she met my gaze. I don't know how to forgive you, but I also don't know how to carry this anymore." Her words weren't an apology. They weren't the reconciliation I had once dreamed of. But they were an opening, a fracture in the wall she had built. And that was enough for now. I took the letters, gently nodding. "You don't have to forgive me today," I said softly. "But you cannot pretend anymore. We both know the truth now." Her lips pressed tightly together. She gave a single nod, then turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway with the cool air brushing against my face. It wasn't closure. Not yet. But it was a beginning. That night, I sat in my living room, the letters beside me, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because I no longer carried the burden alone. I had spoken, and she had heard me. Whether she accepted it or not was no longer mine to control. The house was still quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was mine, my silence, my peace. my story. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, letting the calm wash over me. For the first time, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a woman who had survived a storm and found her own strength in the wreckage. And as I drifted into sleep, I whispered to the shadows of the house, I will not disappear. Not for anyone. Fade out emotional reflection and CTA. Life does not always give us the reconciliation we crave. Sometimes the ones we love most wound us deepest, and their words echo longer than any kindness ever could. But if I've learned anything from this, it's that silence is the most dangerous surrender. When we hide our pain, when we bury our truth, we allow others to define us. I chose to speak. And in speaking, I reclaim myself. My daughter may never see me the way I hope she will. She may never offer the forgiveness I once begged for. But I no longer beg. I no longer wait hunched beneath her rejection. I stand on my own, carrying both my love and my mistakes, and knowing that I am enough. So I ask you, listening to my story, have you ever been made to feel invisible by someone you loved? Have you ever swallowed words until they became poison inside you? Don't let them silence you. Don't let them erase you. Speak your truth, even if your voice trembles. Because sometimes the only way to survive is to stop asking for permission to exist. This was my story. Now I'd like to hear yours. Share with me in the comments if you've ever faced rejection like this. Would you forgive? Or would you stand as I did and reclaim your voice? And if my story has touched you, I ask you to subscribe to Grace's Truth, where stories like mine find the light they deserve. Because no one should ever disappear in silence.